Welcome everyone, and we will start winding down here. So for those that could hear the music, I had to stop it on the right tone there. But welcome to our first Ask Me Anything series hosted by Access CLT Meetup Group. And thank you all so much for watching the recording of this, or certainly those of you who are on live with us right now. Before we go any further, I want to definitely give a thank you to our sponsors for this event as well, and for sponsoring Access CLT, which are Assistive Labs, one of them whom is in the house right now, woo woo, and also my company, Making Accessibility Work, MAW Consulting LLC. So hopefully everyone has grabbed their beverage of choice, maybe their food or snack, and are ready for something like a fireside chat, which is why our featured guest has that great fire background. One last thing though, you'll see a QR code on the screen. That is if you care to support us financially, and also below that is the, so that's on the left-hand side of the screen that I'm sharing right now, and it will come up again after. And then also our meetup group, if you're not part of our meetup group, you can go to meetup.com/access-CLT and find us on Meetup. Make sure you join, because we are going to be continuing to have what we hope are awesome events, and we'd love to involve you in them as well as we're continuing to grow as a group. So I'm going to stop screen share, because today is not about slides and things like that. It is about conversation. And so that is how we're going to get going here. First and foremost, to introduce ourselves and then get going with some conversation. And as I mentioned, feel free to also use the chat to ask and post those questions that you may have. We don't want to overuse the chat, particularly while the conversation is going, because for some people that might be a distraction, but definitely we want to make this engaging and a conversation between you and the participant as well. So make sure that we're this isn't just a webinar, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This is definitely meant to be an interactive conversation. So to get started, who the heck am I and why am I doing all this talking? So I am Michelle Williams. I am an independent digital accessibility consultant, and I live just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. I am an African-American woman with natural hair that is in the process of locking, and I have on my festive green sweater for today. And behind me are a lot of disability books and other resources around that, because again, I work in that space. So I like to promote that in all facets. And today I want to introduce our guest for the hour, Xuan Truong. And Xuan is a licensed clinical social worker. She is a current therapist at Triketra Counseling. She holds an MSW from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and a BA in International Studies from North Carolina State. She hopes to combine her education and experience to empower and strengthen the disability community. So, Xuan, hi.
Hi, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Xuan, and I am part of the Access CLT team, along with Michelle and Lynn, who is also on this call. A brief visual description: I am a Asian American female wheelchair user, wearing a red coat with a fireside background, and I have medium length black hair.
All right, so let's go ahead and start to dive in a little bit and have this conversation. Again, this is Ask Me Anything. So as Lynn just put in the chat, if you have questions as well, what we're trying to do is create a safe space. Now, by creating safe space, that also means that we might want to be still mindful of the types of questions and how they're asked. But the idea is to demystify, particularly living with a disability, and also make sure that it's fully understood in all of the depth and breadth of it. And so we also know that talking to just one person with a disability doesn't answer for everyone else, but talking with one person with a disability can also give you that depth that is often missing when we're talking about that entire spectrum. So today is about going deep and getting a deeper understanding versus also recognizing there's definitely a diversity and a breadth across, right? So we're trying to balance both. And so with that, the first question to help anchor the conversation is, Xuan, can you give us a little bit about your disability, your backstory, and how that disability kind of impacts your day-to-day?
Of course. So I was born with um, a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta. People also call it OI, or brittle bone disease. And so at the age, at the 7 days old, the doctors, they told me, they told my parents that I wasn't going to make it. And then it became 14 days, and then it became a month. And then my dad was just had it with the doctors, and he was like, just however long she lives, she will just let her live, stop putting a deadline on her life. And just growing up, um, the world just wasn't built for me. I couldn't participate in sports or physical activities. My bones were always broken, hence the brittle bone disease name. And it really shaped how I viewed myself and my identity growing up. I hated my disability. I hated that I was a quote unquote burden to my family. And also growing up in a Vietnamese American family, being the first generation, it didn't help that culturally disability wasn't accepted either. And so growing up and then going to college, it was all really just the struggle between like my disability, the intersectionalities between disability culture and a female and living in the South. I had to wrestle and sit in that tension.
And just to clarify, you are a unicorn in that you are a native Charlottean, as we call it. So this is all happening in Charlotte, North Carolina, as the backdrop of all of this. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you for that. So can you describe for us, you've mentioned, this is pretty much from birth onward. What are some of those key moments that stick out for you, whether they were difficulties, opportunities, triumphs, however you want to classify them, but what are some of those key moments, particularly at that intersection of disability and your other identities, that come to mind in the growing up phases?
I think one of the key moments was when I was during my social work grad school program. We have to, before we become social workers, what they do is they make you unpack all of your identities, because if you don't understand yourself, how can you really help others? And so we had to do so many self-reflection papers. And one of those self-reflection papers was unpacking your identity. Well, I've never really identified with my disability. I would always tell people, or like whoever I'm speaking to, that disability is what I have, not who I am. And as I was unpacking, I always identified myself as Vietnamese. I always identified myself as a female, but really like the disability part was more of a diagnosis. So as I began unpacking and like all of my intersections of my identity, I began to realize, oh my goodness, this is a big part of me that I ignored. And if I woke up able-bodied, the next day, what a different world I would have. And just like imagining that, and like I don't know how I would actually live as an able-bodied person, because this is who I am. This is what I've known. This is all I've known. And so to be able to live with an able-bodied, being in an able-bodied body, right? I couldn't really imagine that. So I think that was the key moment where I'm like, no, this is my identity. This is who I am. I don't say I'm, I have Asian American blood, right? Like, no, I'm Asian American. And so instead of saying, I have a disability now, I'm saying I'm disabled. And so it's embracing the identity model of disability.
Can we unpack? Thank you for that. So good. I'm actually going to let people marinate on that a little bit more. But the thing that, so I have a couple of touch points from that. The first is that language part, because as a consultant, for instance, when I come in with the what we call identity first, saying that disabled, say, research participants, if that's what I'm working with, and then I get the banishment of, the gasp in the room that I use disabled in such a strong way. Can we let people understand more about why and how, and is it okay to identify as disabled versus a person with a disability, or avoiding that word and identity altogether?
Of course. So, Michelle, what you're referring to, people with disabilities, is what we call person first language. And so, person first versus identity first, those two come from very different camps of thinking. So, person first actually comes from the education, like higher ed, the professionals who study disability. And so, what it's saying is, no, the person is has a disability, but they're also a person, which inherently isn't bad. And so that's really been accepted and embraced in the educational community and in the professional community. And what we're starting to see now, especially with the younger generation, or what I say, like the more justice-oriented generation of disability, is the identity model camp, where the language of the identity model actually comes from the disability community itself. And it's saying, no, we're taking back that power, we're taking back that language, and we're saying, this is part of who I am. And this is my experience, and there is no shame in that. As of right now, both models are accepted. Perhaps maybe in 10, 20 years, because language and culture changes all the time, maybe that will change.
Yeah. And to that point, okay. One question that's coming through. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, definitely want to read this one. So, as you began to embrace your disability as part of your identity, did you find yourself seeking out and engaging more in the disability community?
Yes, that's a great question. So I was always a part of disabilities groups, like at my university, I was involved in those spaces. However, context, we still live in the South. And my peers at the time, this was a couple of years ago, at the time speaking, the disability community at my school and in my city, they still embraced a more Southern mindset of disability, even though they themselves had disability. And it wasn't until I joined the disability community on the in DC and on the national level that I really that I realized, disability is so much more. And North Carolina is so behind in its thinking and its way of life and the way that disability is treated in this area and in this region.
Yeah, and that's leading into some of the question that's also coming through, which is, how has embracing that identity now changed things for you?
Oh, that's a great question. Just embracing that identity, I feel like, so just to disclose, I'm a person of faith and I really practice it. And I believe that just for me, that I have a purpose, a very specific purpose in life. And I just embracing that identity, it's made my calling so much more clear. And it's like I am now able to go in and say this is who I am. And it's actually freeing because I'm able to be who I was created to be. And I'm not hiding, I'm not ashamed. And I can just let go and just be instead of having to quote unquote prove myself or like overcome something. By the way, overcoming, let me just rant a little bit. We do not use the word overcome in any other circumstances that involve other underrepresented groups, except for disability. No one has ever said you have overcome your Asian Americanness.
And very rarely are our other identities seen as burdens or classified in that way either. Yeah. So you had that epiphany moment, you said, around the time that you were kind of asked to do some self-reflection during your social work program. Do you have any thoughts on what that would have felt like if the world had not seen you or as a burden or as an overcomer, if our world started at a baseline of acceptance of disability as diversity? How might that have even changed the trajectory of that identity that you had to realize basically in adulthood versus growing up?
I think I would have grown up with a lot more confidence and a lot of more empowerment. I think as an adult, I'm unlearning. And I know we're always unlearning, but I have a lot to unlearn. And just being in therapy, journaling, and just doing, what we call inner work. And if I can, if I didn't have all that baggage to unlearn, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think we'll never know.
Yeah. But I think it's that same reflection that you had is important for those of us who don't have a disability to recognize what our viewpoints are doing to other people. So if our viewpoints are in a limited capacity, for instance, then we are putting undue limits on people who didn't ask for that and don't need it and don't appreciate it really. So that's awesome. Tell us a little bit more about how your different intersections of identity have impacted your work and your passion. You talked about having a clear vision of even your purpose as well. So how have those intersections now come to play?
I think at one point I really didn't like it because I would go into any room and no one would have an identity that matches all of mine. And that was hard because I always felt like the unicorn in the room. And I think now I'm beginning to embrace it. There are hard days. There are days where I'm like, oh, I wish people would just understand or be more cultured. I think now I'm starting to embrace it more. And I know that especially where I'm at right now, it is an asset. I can say, hey, I have this experience. I can bring it to the table, and I know for sure you don't have it.
Yeah, as a sort of a personal anecdote, having been around you and been out with you, we call you the Kevin Bacon of Charlotte because it feels like you know everyone in Charlotte and beyond. But part of that, I think, is because you stand out. Now,
Mhm.
whether that's, I kind of want to ask how you feel about that because, like you said, you are unique, and even your presence in a room is going to be unique for a variety of different reasons. Whether you ask for it or not, I think it's going to happen. So how do you feel about standing out in such a way?
It's interesting. I forget his name, but he is one of um, he's a songwriter in the disability community, and I went to an event that he was doing, and one of the lyrics that really stuck out to me in that song was, people, you were the first to be noticed and you were the last to be noticed. And and obviously he's talking about himself who has a visible disability. And I think we notice visually when when someone is different, who looks different from you. At the same time, I think we have a bias in our mind of, oh, who is fit for this job, or who is fit to answer this question, or um, fulfill this role. And I think that's where disability goes unnoticed.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Thank you. Um, Speaking of some of those biases and even sometimes that just blatant discrimination, I think we know what blatant discrimination looks like. So you touched on it a little bit, like you're not going to get this job because I don't think that your whatever is going to fit or things like that. But have you had experiences with what we now know are calling microaggressions? Those ones where maybe even the person doing it doesn't recognize that they are doing something discriminatory towards you.
Of course. So I work at the local performing arts theater. And there was this one time, or there's actually been a couple times where I'm working and patrons will be like, can I take a picture with you? And then one time I asked, why do you want a picture? And then the lady was like, oh, because you're special. And I should have told my boss, but I kind of let it go. I told her I was busy, or we don't do that. And then it's I see this a lot in the South where it's more paternalistic in the care model of disability, which is people with disabilities need to be cared for. And that is very alive and well here in North Carolina. And I just get called things like sweetheart or honey, and get treated very much like a child. And then I think one of the biggest ones is people will ask me about my age. And I'm still trying to find like a snarky response to that question. Like, you don't go to a grown woman and ask about her age. And so I'm still trying to navigate that. And unfortunately, that question annoys me more as the years go by.
Yeah, yeah. Well, age woman, no, I'm kidding. So no, but I've been with you to experience some of those as well. And so to your point, those are those even micro, they're still, there's still aggressions and there's still things that are very unfortunate. And so that's why we're having events like this. That's why we're having forums like this, to make sure that it's clear that what people may think is well-meaning or helpful is not. And we've been taught that certain behaviors are well-meaning and beneficial, and they're not. And this is coming again from someone who's telling you on the other receiving end of it, it's not. And so with that, and continue please to put your questions in the chat. We've had great ones coming in. I hope that this is resonating with you and helping you in the audience that are watching. Let's switch a little bit more to even some more of those practical things about accessibility. So you talked about being a wheelchair user. And so what are some of those practical things you'd like to talk about in terms of what makes things accessible or inaccessible for you?
For the longest time, I didn't have a car. I didn't have a car that I could drive. And so with applying for jobs that probably didn't need it, must have a car or must have a reliable vehicle. And I'm like, do you really? What if I live next door and the job itself doesn't require any driving? And I think like little things like that really puts a barrier. What reliable transportation looks different for everybody. Oh yeah, and Lynn was like parking spot at my place. So I moved to a condo about a year ago, and it took like a year to get an accessible parking space where I could put my ramp down. And that took a little bit more effort than it should have.
Yeah, and so before I forget, Lynn did put thank you for being vulnerable with us in the chat, and some other people are echoing that. So wanted to make sure that we said that aloud to you. And thank you so much for your vulnerabilities, because some of these are real life situations and real life implications. But I'm gonna pause you there on that parking space, because for some people, they're probably thinking, what about the ADA? So doesn't the ADA solve for this? Why was that even an issue to begin with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I live in a private residence and the ADA doesn't apply.
And therefore, and so there it is. So the lesson there is you can still have civil protections in place, but they have to be enforced and reinforced. And so what else comes up as you literally even navigate spaces, either digitally or in person or sort of in between, that we'll stay on the inaccessible side for now, and then maybe we'll talk about some ways that maybe even surprisingly were more accessible for you.
Well, I think my main barriers are physical accessibility. So buildings uptown that um, have not been um, what is it? Not reconstructed, but like um, have not been remodeled to be ADA compliant. Yes, renovated. Thank you. And like a lot of small businesses where, again, there's a loophole for smaller businesses where they don't need to um, be in compliance with the ADA. And depending on how old the building is, that is also a loophole. And they can also say, well, this is an historic building and we don't need to do it because it's going to ruin the history of the building. So, in my argument to those answers are, well, you're missing out on 25% of business and capital because you're making your place of business inaccessible. And that doesn't just go for buildings too, that goes for vacations, traveling, planes. I think I saw a post that said 35 wheelchairs get damaged by planes, like airports, every day.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with that, please start doing some research on airline accessibility or the lack thereof, particularly for wheelchair users. Right there, I saw some early prototypes of some ways that they're trying to finally turn this around. But essentially, if you are a wheelchair user trying to fly, they take you out of your wheelchair and put you into a seat. Think about how just unfathomable that part is. And then they stow your wheelchair with the luggage, but don't treat it very well. So your wheelchair can get lost, just like luggage gets lost. It can get damaged, just like luggage gets damaged. And when we're talking about something like someone's extension of themselves and $10,000 upwards, and it can and has had life-threatening impacts for those who are trying to travel by air. So, somewhat of a content warning there, but yeah, so that is very serious. And this is what happens when we are not mindful of the diversity of humans when we do things. Yeah. But Xuan, has there been an opportunity to experience anything, particularly maybe in, like you said, the younger folks are empathy minded, justice minded, things like that. Have there been any moments that give you a little glimmer of hope that maybe some of these experiences that you've had might not happen for others or might turn around for you?
Of course, one of when I was interning at the national level, I was in spaces with disabled movers and shakers in the arena. And I have asked everyone that I could get access to, hey, what brings you hope? Because this is a long game, this is a lifetime worth of work. And I need to know what I'm fighting for. And I need to know that it's going to be worth it. And one of the most empowering and encouraging advice that I got was from Maria Town. She's the CEO of AAPD, the American Association for People with Disabilities. And she told me that babies born today will have privileges and opportunities that we can only dream of. And that really sparked me. And that really put language to what I believe is my purpose in the season, is to set up a foundation. And because disability is so tied into politics and so tied into civil rights, and we all know politics is a long game, it really put language to, yes, some days it's gonna feel like nothing is happening. And I might not see the fruits of it in my lifetime. And that's okay. Because I want to build that foundation. And I want to leave the next generation of disabled leaders and the children that come after me with the foundation that they can build on. And as far as things changing, when I was leaving UNT Charlotte, I had mentioned earlier that the circles of disabled students I was in really had a very traditional mindset of disability, even though they were had disabilities themselves. When I was leaving my very last semester, new students started identifying with their disability. And not only were they identifying with it, they were using language like disabled and neurodivergent and ADHDers. And they were very justice oriented. And I had created a couple of initiatives during my last year there. And as far as I know, those initiatives are still going strong. And they are still, like, disability has now been put on the map at the university. And the language is all over the website. Students are leading groups. The Career Center, which where I used to work, they have a grad assistant that identifies with a disability, and their whole job is to reach out to the disabled students to help them advance in their careers. So yes, there are fruits, and things are getting better, or whatever that means, improving, progressing.
Yeah, and that was part of what I was going to ask too, and so keep going. But what things would you like to see changed or different than what they are today? What are some of those bullet points of action items, as much as you can speak to, as much as you've reflected on? Do you have a list of what you're aiming for to be different?
Ooh, I don't think I've ever thought about this. I think at very minimum, something that I was working on at the national level was sub minimum wage. And for those that aren't familiar, people with disabilities, it is legal if you have a 14C certificate under the Fair Labor Standards Act that companies are allowed to pay you 2 cents on the hour. And they're called sheltered workshops. And they are alive in North Carolina. Last time I checked. And it is very much alive on the in America, yes. And there is a YouTube documentary. You can search it. It's called Bottom Dollars. And it is a whole documentary on sheltered workshops, people who have worked in them, advocates who are fighting against them. And it's really eye-opening that some of these big companies that we shop at every day are employing people 2 cents on the hour. And I'm super passionate about this because I'm making careers accessible is kind of my thing. And there was a hearing a couple of weeks ago on sub-minimum wage. And I'm kind of glad I didn't go because my blood would have boiled over the surface. But a lot of parents were on the call, and they were like, if y'all close down sheltered workshops, where are my kids going to go? If you close down sheltered workshops, my kids' purpose, they won't have any. And it was very much parent oriented and very much parent voices. So yes, I would love to see us get paid equally. I don't think that's too hard to ask. But I think it also is.
Right. It is when it seems to be the accepted practice. And to that point, a charity mindset, a charity model. Again, that takes us all the way back even to the beginning when we talked about that sense of lowered expectations. They say that a lot in the National Federation of the Blind as well, that disability is not about lowered expectations. You should not have lower expectations of me because of a disability than you do someone who does not at least have a disability that you can perceive. And so that idea of a parent of a disabled child, talk about that a little bit more. I think there's more to unpack there.
My goodness, they're the bane of my existence. So we see this a lot in the cognitive, intellectual disability spaces, where the parents are the voices and the child is secondary. And it goes back to infantilization, the care model, the charity model of disability. And there's so many organizations that are parent-led. And unfortunately, parents have a stronger voice in the political space because politicians can associate on the parent level versus on the disability level. And so there's an automatic connection and an automatic point of empathy. And that makes it really tough for things like sheltered workshops or like day treatment centers. And also institutionalization of disability to be fully integrated into the community. One of the things that I talk about a lot is the dignity of risk. And it's the idea of people with disabilities aren't allowed to take risk because it's too dangerous. And that's my argument is that's where safety leads to segregation. Is because if we try and we fail, yes, the consequences are going to be way higher. And also, how far are you going to keep us safe? And what does that do to our dignity as human beings?
I love that. And you and I were talking about, speaking of the transportation part, you just finished driving lessons, and now hopefully we'll be back able to get into a vehicle. But you were telling me some of the backstory around that, and I told you we were going to bring that up here because I loved how you summed it up. So can you talk a little bit about that process of getting the driving license around this time around?
Of course. So I started the driving process around high school, so around like 2010. And it's taken me 13 years to actually get my own car, and a car that's adapted and I can drive it. So I've been driving for about going on 3 weeks now, independently. However, back in 2020, my vehicle was adapted, everything was in place for me to drive. And I was sitting in the car with the trainer. I was about a couple of weeks out of training. I mean, going to be a couple of weeks before I finish my training. And so the trainer was in the car, and I did an overcorrection as I was turning and hit a telephone pole. And it hit right between the headlights, and it totaled the vehicle. And it took 3 years for me to get to this past the stage I was at. And so one of the things that my former professor said that really stuck out to me in social work was you tax the poor with their time. And in the disability community, things that are so basic take so much time to achieve. So during those 13 years that I was going through the driving process, I saw kids, 16-year-old kids, get their licenses in a couple of days. I saw my cousins who immigrated from another country to this one get their licenses in a car in a matter of weeks. So, but for me, it took more than a decade just for something so basic such as driving.
And then you had also made a point about a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Tell
And
us
so
about
that one little mistake of overcorrection costed me 3 years and money and stress because there was pressure for me not to drive again.
right, which wouldn't necessarily have been there had
Mm-hmm.
you been a non-disabled person who gets into an accident, they get a new vehicle and they try again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the arguments that my boss at the time, she was really advocating for me. She was like, exactly what you said, Michelle. Xuan is a new driver. She made a mistake. It was just a mistake. You wouldn't punish a new driver if they didn't have a disability on this level.
Awesome. Yeah, that dignity of risk. So we're gonna wind down. Don't leave yet, everyone. We've got a few closing announcements as well, but I want to give opportunity for any last questions and thank you all for hanging in there with us. Again, we hope that this has been helpful, informative, enlightening, empowering, all the INGs. And so, Xuan, as our featured guest for today, again, thank you so much for being vulnerable, for sharing, for stating things that do not yet align with sometimes the common core thinking, for sharing, again, personal stories as well. So as we wrap up and transition into a wrap up, are there, besides all you've already dropped on us, are there any other nuggets that you have as parting words for us today?
I think conversations on identity. I hope that one day this will be outdated. And I hope that disability becomes more integrated into the community where you can just talk about it with your friends. And in personal spaces. And I hope that these conversations play a part in that, in making disability a little bit more demystifying and a little bit more normal, because disability is part of the human experience.
Awesome. Thank you. And so funny you said demystifying. I mentioned I have some books up on my shelf. One of them is Demystifying Disability, Emily Ladau, as well as Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong, and also the autobiography or the memoir of Miss Judy Heumann, considered the mother or maybe even godmother of the disability rights movement. And so we encourage you to keep learning and advocating and doing the work, doing the good trouble, as the late John Lewis would say, in bringing about disability inclusion, which is the goal of Access CLT as well. And so, because I'm really good at segues, that then leads us to our final wrap up. Sorry for seeing my ugly screen real quick. Okay. So thank you so much again for joining an Access CLT event, which is the name of our meetup group. So please join us on the meetup group, because we do toggle between virtual events. So again, we're international now. We had a Canadian on today. So we toggle between virtual events and also the in-person ones. And so with that, stay tuned in the meetup group for our next event. We don't have a date just yet, but it will be in February. We will be visiting the Charlotte Assistive Technology Center. It's in East Charlotte. These are some photos of some of the many, probably thousands of devices and equipment that they have in different stations at the Assistive Technology Center. We're going to set up a big event there where people can learn about all of these different devices for independent living that are available. Also, we have a QR code if you'd like to scan that, but more so, just make sure you join our meetup group and stay connected with us. And, as we say, let's make Charlotte accessible together. And also, as we're wrapping up, this is happening at the new year. We want to acknowledge the new year and ask that you prosper and be successful in all that you are going to do at the end of this year and going into next year. So thank you so much for joining. And Elena, I see your note there. We will follow up with you in the chat as well. But because this is moving, I'm going to stop share. But just wanted to give you that, and just thank you again for joining us. And Xuan or Lynn, our other co-lead as well for Access CLT, anything else before we part? I see no. All right, everyone. Well, thank you. And we'll see you at the next event. Bye-bye.